Good afternoon, everyone. I think we might get started because we're running a little bit behind time. Just like to welcome you all to this session on international and globalisation in medical radiation science. I think that says. I'd like to kick off with Associate Professor Jeff Curry, known to a few people in the room here. He is the professor at Charles Sturt University and also a leading light in the rural health and rural nuclear medicine. So over to you, Jeff.
Thanks, Peter. We might just get those doors closed if we could. Though a bit of a party happening out the back there. So this is some work that David and I have done over the last few years, looking at. And I think that it really fits with the World Federation of Nuclear Medicine Biology. I've been asked a few times what the highlight of this program has been for me, and that's not necessarily the educational aspect of it, because let's be honest, you can get education in a number of avenues and venues. For me, it's about seeing how we're actually those global citizens, and we don't normally see that at an ANZ SNM meeting or an SNM meeting. We tend to be a little bit insular, even though we have our international guests that come to those meetings. But at the World Federation, what we're seeing is that genuine global citizenship that we sort of embed in some of our curriculum that we teach our students, or that we embed in our professional statements, but we don't often exhibit it and what it actually means to be that to have that globalisation. So it's kind of fitting to with this conference that we're talking about, globalisation and what the opportunities are for partnering beyond those. So I'm going to talk about what globalisation and internationalisation are, and David's going to give you a few examples, and then I'll come back and talk about partnering after that. So I guess the learning outcome that we put in the abstract was to understand the drivers for globalisation and internationalisation. Ignore the higher education bit, that's a leftover. So globalisation and internationalisation are similar, but they're not the same. And so they're related. And so an industry responds to the global economic and academic trends, and those that are driven by our industry, and that's called globalisation. And one aspect of that globalisation is internationalisation, which is a strategic approach adopted by a specific industry, in this case nuclear medicine, to respond to a global market. And I think that's what we are here at the World Federation to do. And so when we look at the actual stages of globalisation, how it's come along, is that you go back a long time and you've got the camel traders along the Silk Road, and then we had colonialisation, which Australia is a major part of, and the Industrial Revolution, which we all study in our history books. And then we had this period of American dominance, and now we've actually, and that went for a long time, and even in nuclear medicine we had that period of American dominance. And we're now at this stage that the technology has evolved to the point where we're not. It's this decentralised model of internationalisation, where the US is not dominant and Australia or Europe is not dominant, but we're genuine citizens of one planet. And if there are barriers there, they're artificial now. So internationalisation can be viewed as a strategic development of an international and intercultural awareness and perspectives within a profession, so within the profession of nuclear medicine, to produce those global professionals and global citizens. So it's not just about being able to move from employment-wise from one country to the other, because there are some legislative issues around that with visas and things, but it's about having that broader citizenship. And some of the examples that we can use are the Canadian Journal, the Journal of Medical Imaging and Radiation Science, has been part of a three-journal group that we sort of initiated a few years ago, where we actually use a Twitter-based journal club. So we actually have a journal club where three of the journals, including the Canadian Journal, will actually discuss across the globe. There'll be people from all walks of RT, radiography and nuclear medicine discussing a concept or a topic from their time zone and in real time. And then recently, the Journal of Nuclear Medicine Technology has done one that's just been purely nuclear medicine technologist focused. And so these are ways that we can actually have that citizenship using technology. So obviously there's a quote there that to marvel at all that one can see is to ignore the majesty that lies beyond the horizon. And sometimes we do, is that we sit there and go, okay, well, we only go as far as we can see. And for those that listen to Brian's plenary session earlier, is that talking about the stars and, you know, to be able to shoot high, and sometimes you don't make it, but you're certainly, you know, not going to get there if you don't try. So we need to think about those things that are beyond where we can see, because technology allows us to interact with those. So it's about our students as they come through, as well as the practitioners. So at universities, we equip our students with that philosophy and understanding of that they're global citizens. So they're coming into the employment market with that kind of attitude, and so they're integrating in a workforce that range from recent graduates through to people that have been there for 40 years. And things have changed during that time, and so we actually have this infiltration and dilution of global citizens in that. So we need to respond to that as professionals, people that have been in industry for a long time. And then we have leaders that actually do it. So, you know, Liz is sitting here, who has been driving international relations for the ANZ S&M for a long time. And so you can't just have these newbies coming in from universities and a couple of leaders that do the hard work, and everyone else going, okay, well, that's just the status quo, and everyone else is doing the work. We all need to be part of it. We all need buy-in. And so the practitioners need to broaden their minds and look to those new ideas. And we heard in an earlier session, from Karen and Peter about advanced practice, and that internationalisation is going to be a really key point, or key part of it, and our global citizenship is going to be a key part of how we move advanced practice forward. And so it needs to have those developing capabilities that transcend any geographic, cultural, as well as political boundaries. And geographic and cultural are pretty easy to overcome. The political ones sometimes not so much, as David and I have encountered with, some of the most, what appears to be really easy strategies coming undone because of politics. And so we need to think about what motivates academic institutions, as well as our professional bodies and our individual employers, so whether we're in public or private sectors, as to what happens on that front, whether it's the learning front or the professional front. And when we say learning front, we're talking about everybody. We're all learning. Is the second that you think that you don't have to learn anymore, you should be leaving the industry. Okay, it's not just continuing professional development, it's lifelong learning. Is it? So if you're not learning, then you're going to be a stagnant cesspool, basically. So we don't want you in the profession. So it's all about learning. And so global citizenship means developing the skills and capabilities, the knowledge and attitudes, and obviously the attributes that are required for applying our trade professionally within communities, our national community, and beyond those boundaries that sometimes are either political, cultural, or geographic. So it extends that whole philosophy and to the flow and movement of people. Okay, so it's not just about movement of people across borders and things. It's ideas and technology, and also the economy. And the World Federation of Nuclear Medicine and Biology plays a really important role in that. Is that we've actually seen numerous presentations that highlight and Pete talked about it in his advanced practice presentation, that talked about the inequity of distribution of services in healthcare and finances that go with that between some parts of rural Australia and the rest of it. And we see that on a global market as well, the rich countries versus countries that are developing and those that are undeveloped. And so, it's about creating a little bit of equity it's driven a little bit of equity along those lines as well. So there's some of the really motivators. Some of them are financial and some of them are a bit more altruistic. So globalisation's growth, it's science, it's technology, it's driven by communication and the environment and culture and wealth. And it's really important to see that all those things are an important mix, and we've got to get the balance right to get true globalisation. So what are our motivations? And I don't know whether any of you guys feel like, you employ internationalisation or globalisation strategies and where that might fit with you, but what's your motivation to do it? And again, coming back to advanced practice, we talked about, what are the motivators to do it? And it's not necessarily finance. Sometimes it's driven by finance, but real success comes when there's intrinsic motivation, not extrinsic motivation. That's what we should be looking for. So whether it's advanced practice or globalisation, if you're intrinsically motivated, it's going to be far more sustainable than if you're chasing some sort of extrinsic goal. But you can't ignore that to actually get something off the ground, when we go to our legislators or we go to our employers, we have to make an argument around what the commercial advantage is. And the commercial advantage might relate to market share, might relate to finance, but it might actually relate to control and ownership of intellectual property as well. And in the end, we want to enhance those outcomes. So what it provides is the integration of research, and so that's one of my big motivators, is to actually look at how we integrate research globally, enhancing English language communication, and we have some really good partnerships into China in particular, where there's a big push to actually get things into English language research rather than native language. It grows international labour markets and makes it a more liquid environment, and what that does is provide more sustainability to individuals. You know, an individual country is susceptible to small fluctuations in the market in that country. But if you're looking at a global market, if they're out of flux, or out of synchrony, then you've actually got some more flexibility. It's why someone buys 10 pubs and they don't just own one, because one can go under if you've got 10. When one's, you know, not doing so well, the others are actually thriving. So.
Pub in Australia does well, mate.
No, I actually know a consortium of guys, 10 guys that own 10 pubs, and some of them are in the snowfields and some of them are on the coast, and so, you know, they thrive at different times of the year. So they have a constant income stream. It's enhanced by and drives communication and publishing, which is another big driver, and, you know, professionalism is linked to that, is that, you know, we want to be professionals, and I had this discussion earlier, you know, are we a profession? Because if we're a profession, then we should be autonomous. We shouldn't be dictated by the physicians, as being the traditional model in the 1980s. We need to be autonomous, and if we have autonomy, then we also have ownership of our own knowledge economy. And if our knowledge economy needs publication, if it's just what we know between ourselves, well, then that's not professionalism. So if we're not publishing stuff, if we don't own our own intellectual property, then we're not really a profession. So obviously it's enhanced by IT and learning, and then looking at those e-learning opportunities. But the problem is that globalisation concentrates wealth, knowledge and power. And so people can get greedy about it, and then all of a sudden is that it actually becomes a centralised rather than decentralised model. And it's really important that when we look at the World Federation of Nuclear Medicine and Biology, one of the things that it really has overcome is that generosity. And I've made that comment to a few people about the generous leadership that has you know, been on exhibit from many people, but in particular Andrew Scott, in the way that we've actually done this. And so we need to be mindful that some people are going to see it as a way of grabbing power, and if that's the issue, it's never going to succeed. Complex diagram, but it's just all of the things that feed into globalisation. So obviously things from the basics, which we tend to focus mostly on, but then there's this whole other cultural, political and economic environment. They're a lot more difficult to try to, you know, weave your way through, but for success, you need to be able to manage all of those. So then internationalisation, given internationalisation is a strategy per se, so it's a strategy to achieve globalisation, and we need to be mindful that there's a whole bunch of undercurrents that go with it, and that's the things I've already mentioned: profit and profile and market share and owning outcomes and owning intellectual property. And you've got to try to manage those along the way, no matter how altruistic you are about your motivation. So while the motivators for an individual or a corporate level, you know, might not be so, is that we need to think about some of the other institutional type objectives and needs, like staff mobility, which gives you a bit more retention and control of your market, enhanced experiences, additional skill sets, which may be, you know, enhancement of your scope of practice, or it might be advanced practice that we talked about earlier. Engagement with your profession, and your profession goes beyond that. The cultural plunge, so actually what you bring back after, you know, immersing yourself in other cultural experiences. And we've seen that when I go to Canada and work with the Canadians, or the US, and Liz is the same, and other people, is that you bring a little bit back to your environment, and that little bit of cultural sharing has a big difference. So it's an amazing opportunity for all, basically. And so when we look at that global mobility, or global workforce mobility, we're talking about things that you have to, you know, consider as your HR support, immigration, employment law, you know, taxes and social security, There's a whole bunch of risks that needs to be managed, and of course, what you actually need in sort of talent in the first place. And so it's about seizing the day. And so, we're at a really good position on the back of this Congress in particular, but also what's going on in the global market, to take advantage of that and actually seize what we have today. Because if we wait 12 months before we sort of take action, it's going to sort of start to embed back to existing structures, and we're going to lose that opportunity for globalisation and really enhancing our global citizenship. So I'll sort of leave it there, and I'll pick up back after David gives you a couple of examples. And so obviously, I think that when you think about leadership, is that that's our opportunity as individuals and collectively as a profession to actually lead the way and go tread paths that haven't been trodden before. Is that I think that we sometimes are a little bit shy about that and wait for someone else to take the lead, and I think that sometimes we just need to do it collectively. So I think the time has come for that. And I think we're doing questions at the end. Is that right?
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you, Jeff. So we now have David Gilmore extending on that topic to talk on internationalization and globalization, impact on nuclear medicine. Thank you, David.
Oh, great. Absolutely. So good afternoon, everyone. How are you? So as Jeff said, I'm going to provide a little bit more examples and maybe how this impacts us as technologists in particular. But I also knew this is one of the last sessions, right, and that we would have very few people, right? As you remember, I chaired on day one where I kept telling people come to the front of the room. So now we're spreading out the wealth here, right? So anyway, but I thought we would have a little bit of fun before we kind of get started with that. And when we talk about kind of what is, oops, wrong direction. When we talk about global icons, I think it's very easy for us to jump out of nuclear medicine and talk about the global environment, right? Whether it's Lady Gaga and all her crazy stories that she used to do, or some of the songwriters that she now writes with and so forth, and we all kind of agree that yes, she has a talented voice, yes, she's a great songwriter and so forth, or Prince and the morning of his death and so forth, to Madonna. So a lot of these individuals can kind of change, and we all know globally who they are, right? The same is true when we actually look at different places around the world. Anytime you see these pictures, you instantly know where we're at, what we're talking about, whether it's Paris or London or certainly in Sydney, Australia, right? They're iconic buildings that we do. There's also a lot that we talk about iconic that's in healthcare, but maybe not to the same extent. And I'm going to provide some of those examples a little bit better and why we want to get to more of a global recognition of that. Jeff talked a little bit about the global economy, and that absolutely is a driving force. And without doubt, no matter how much you like these brands or don't like these brands, they are recognizable brands, and they are a major driving force. It's what continues to grow that. It's what continues to make those products sustainable, is looking at it from a true global perspective. Now, I have to add here, this is a very funny piece. I just threw McDonald's in on this because I knew Jeff had it in one of his previous slides, but on Saturday or Friday, whichever day it was, I had went up to the, is it the Queen Victoria markets or the Melbourne markets? I wasn't ever quite sure on the name. But anyway, there was a t-shirt and it had McDonald's, well, it had the M arch on it, right? But it said marijuana, and under it said, overly addictive, it's why I'm fat. And I just could not stop laughing over this, right? I'm like, it is. That's the unfortunate piece, right? But they've done a great job with that and really kind of capitalizing on that. But so I thought, well, let's take a step back and let's make a little bit of fun of this, because we're going to have to address some of this in nuclear medicine as this changes, right? And that words get lost in transition, or in translation rather. So here, what would many of you call this? A biscuit, right? Not in the US, right? In the US, this is what we call a biscuit. I call a softer stone, right? That would be a better piece for that. Or what about this? This one's a little bit more common. Those names are beginning to do, right? As chips. We certainly wouldn't call these chips in the US, we would call these French fries. I would say even North America as a whole, not just as Karen's like granting yes from Canada. This is what we would call chips, and you would call this crisp, right? So there is some.
We call them chips.
Oh, you call.
Everything's
Well, that's
chips.
not confusing. Oh wait, what the top is what?
Hot chips.
Hot chips? Oh, I learned something new today.
No, it's only if it's skinny that we call them fries. We still call them fries, but they've got to be skinny fries.
Like McDonald's.
Oh. See? Lost in translation, right? This is a great way to end these sessions, isn't it? Okay, so we got one more. This one, I'm not really sure what it's called in Australia. I know what it's called over in the UK with this. Okay, so we would call this a Band-Aid as well, right? But in the UK, they would most likely call this a plaster. If you ask for a plaster in the US, and maybe here in Australia as well, you're going to get someone coming out giving you a quote of how to plaster your wall, right, if you need to do some construction work with things. And then the last, I think, is moving us more toward kind of what we're talking about is when we talk about pharmacist in the US, we're definitely talking about the top picture, whereas in many countries, that's still called a chemist or referred to as a chemist, and we really think of chemist more, at least in North America, as the behind-the-scene bench individual who does have a chemistry degree, mixing chemicals and so forth with that. So it's like, okay, well, what's this mean for nuclear medicine, and why do we necessarily care? This is the easy part, right? All names we recognize. When we say Siemens, we know we're talking about camera manufacturers. We know what we're doing. If we're talking about DAT scans, we know we're talking about brain agents and so forth, right? And Cardiolite definitely was the days of cardiac. But that's not really what we talk about or what we want to talk about when we're talking about globalization and really what it means for the technologist in nuclear medicine. And this is what a driving force is. We continue to hear about molecular imaging, right? Even our own profession is confused about what exactly molecular imaging is, what is included in that, what's not included in that. And if we're unable to speak about the common language, then it's very difficult worldwide to talk about the same information, and more importantly, to kind of grow that specialty that ultimately helps all of us. So let's do a little quiz. This is great and easy because there's not a room full of people. What do you think molecular imaging is? It may be hard. Hopefully you can see it in the background. Do we think this is molecular imaging? We'll show you all three, and then we'll come back and vote for which one it is. Do we think this is molecular imaging? Or do we think this is molecular imaging? So let's go back. Let's show by show of hands. How many people think this is molecular imaging? Okay, a couple people. How many think this is molecular imaging? And ultimately, you can vote for more than one if you want, right? And how many think this is molecular imaging, right? Well, in fact, there is becoming a common definition for it, which really, if you want to sum it up, it's being able to get quantifiable information, true data, as well as our traditional imaging-based picture-looking things. So if we take those two definitions together, then this is really what the definition of molecular imaging is. Now, it includes a whole host of modalities, right? It is not just nuclear medicine. MRI can help in this situation. Certain parts of sonography can kind of help in this arena, certainly optical imaging, and many other imaging things that are coming down the road. So if we're able to quantify specifically what we're looking at in the disease state and be able to get an image on that, then we're going to kind of lump that into the molecular imaging, molecular imaging category. And so how's that translate? Well, how that translate and where we need to get moving on this is that today, if we asked anyone, why is it that you image cancer? There's some topics that people could agree on, right? It's definitely diagnosing or staging those individuals depending on what extent you have, maybe if you have PET CT or just SPECT CT. Treatment effects, how's that individual doing? Is this working? Maybe a 3-year follow-up, 4-year follow-up or something. But the challenge we have is this kind of 1 millimeter challenge, right? If we're not able to move beyond just identifying that tumor, then we really are limiting ourselves as to what the growth potential that we have in this field, particularly if we continue to look at new isotopes and radiopharmaceuticals for that. Where we need to be going is we need to be able to categorize those tumors. We need to say, you as an individual, this is the type of tumor you have, and this is what that tumor is made of. If we're able to do this, and we heard yesterday on a couple of lectures and the day before around personalized medicine, this is a huge component for this. We know not everyone is going to respond to treatments the same way. So being able to identify how those individuals are going to respond is really something that we've been able to do for a really long time and really need to be able to capitalize on that. Even more so now that as the technology changes and the radiopharmaceuticals change, we need to really be able to kind of enhance that. And so if you look at this image, right, pictures are always worth 1,000 words, and it's kind of what you want the referring physicians to know, because that's what keeps the referring physicians coming back, right? It's kind of that global economy. More studies that we have ordered and can perform, then the better we're going to grow as a field. And so this patient returned 4 weeks later after a chemotherapy dose after it was identified. And if this is what you're looking at, would you say this patient's responding to that chemo? Absolutely. So do we then, from that point, there's a whole host of other decisions, right? Do we need to keep them on this treatment options? Can we pull them off for this? Do we need to look for something else? Can we go to surgery now? A whole host of different ideas. But if this image 4 weeks beyond this looks exactly like the first one, then that treatment's not working. We don't need to keep saying, well, let's try it for another 4 to 6, 8 weeks on this, right? That patient is not responding to this, and so we need to kind of re-identify really what's happening and where are we going. I've shown this a couple of times, so if you've heard me speak at other meetings, I think this is extremely important. We have to move out of we are just an imaging modality. Yes, we have imaging in our name, in our background, but really we need to start to move more toward what is the biological effects and understanding what that means, particularly for patients. We have great physicians who we work with all the time, and we have some that we need to help along sometimes, right? But at the end of the day, this is a teamwork effort of really being able to understand whether or not we're going to be able to help provide and give that information that the referring physician is looking for or that they need to do. And I know many technologists, many of you are sitting here in the room, who continue to question, why are we doing this study? What is the purpose of this study? Why do you think we should do this? Those are all great questions, right? And the more we continue to enhance our knowledge collectively as a whole and move down here in the biology section and being able to understand what it is that we're talking about from chemical makeups of tumors, if we're talking about tumor imaging, or something involving the cardiac cycle or something, the better we are, the more respect we have to be able to have those conversations to really kind of move our progression or our field forward, as opposed to, what do you want me to do? Just tell me what test to order and I'll do the test. That's really not what we should be doing. And Jeff talked a little bit about that, is that's why we want to push our field forward with it. So how's that apply to nuclear medicine, right? That's what we're really here for. And more importantly, what it means for technologists. So about 13 different professional organizations came together to really kind of create this nuclear medicine global initiative. It was formed in 2012. Initially, when it was formed, the technologist section of many of the organizations weren't necessarily a vital part of this. They were in on many of the discussions, but it's been in the last, I would say, 3 to 4 years that there has been a much greater input from the technologist sections of all of our organizations that we belong to say, where do we fit into this and where can we kind of make that impact? And more importantly, why do we care about that, right? Because it's very easy for all of us in our own institutions to just fold in and be like, I'm doing 12 bone scans today, 14 cardiacs, 5 PET CTs, whatever your numbers are, right? And just continue to do those studies, push them forward, and move on. So it's like, I don't really care what's happening in Australia or wherever. But I'm going to show maybe why we should care about that and how that's going to help us. So what happened was the groups came together and said, okay, we need to start tackling some projects that are similar among all of us and not replicate what we're doing, or more importantly, having conflicting results. If we start having conflicting what it means to do certain things, then it's going to appear as though it's a profession that is really disjointed, and it's going to be very difficult to get buy-in from referring physicians who don't necessarily care about each of our individual organizations. What they care about is, what can molecular imaging do for me, and how can you get that promoted, right? That's ultimately the end of the day. So one of the first projects that was decided was that we should look at really the pediatric populations and look at some standardizations for that. The US, the SNMMI, kind of had its stance on this. The ANZ, SNM had kind of their stance a little bit on this. The Canadian Society and the European Association all had slightly different kind of tactics and how you would approach standardization with that. So this was really the first group, was to tell us what resources you have, let's bring this together and kind of form. It ended up in kind of a two-part publication that is out and available now. And now, since then, there's quite a few projects that are undergoing with that. Certainly here at the World Fed, that's a great place to kind of bring all this together. And as Jeff said, we have the momentum going. As I said, about the last 3.5 to 4 years has really been this movement to get to this point and have true internationalization or globalization, if you want to focus on that from the technologist perspective. But what it is what it's created is the hot topics. And so as we go around, and I'm happy to be here in Australia, right? It's much warmer weather than it is in Boston, I'll tell you. And everybody was like, oh, it's Melbourne, the weather's not great. And it's like, well, when I left Boston, there was about 8 inches of snow on the ground. So this is beautiful weather. But what happened with us all getting together and creating these kind of international things is looking at exchange programs. And these exchange programs, we really need to invest more in, and I'll talk about where we've been and what some of the challenges have been that we need to overcome with that. Education is a huge component, not thinking about just students, right? All of us are trying to figure out and grapple with CT. Is MR going to be a huge component that we need to work with? What is the relevance of PET MR that's going to have with that? Looking at practice standards, we're not saying that everyone across the globe needs to do everything exactly the same, but what we do need to have is some set of minimum guidelines that we can all do and say, yes, this is our profession, and how do we own that profession? Dose reduction is a huge piece. I'll talk a little bit about that in a project that the technologist section from 5 organizations have worked on and created an article for that. The molybdenum supply, not as much of an issue here in Australia because you have your own, but for the rest of the world, this is a massive challenge, particularly with the Canadian system going away. And then just in general, isotope and radiopharmaceutical challenges that we have. How can we get them approved faster in more countries? How can we utilize that data and not every country having to go through their own kind of studies to get things approved and so forth? Will ultimately, at the end of the day, help us grow our field faster, and the faster we grow it, then it really helps all of us with that. So again, I told you a little bit about the collaboration that's occurring with the professional organizations. At each of the major meetings, we do have representatives. So you do have technologists here from Australia who participate in the international activities and what are we doing with that. Gives you a little bit of things that are coming up at the SNMMI in Philadelphia. But what I thought I would do is kind of break this down, is that we want to create exchange programs, right? Some of you may remember there used to be some exchange programs that occurred and was very beneficial to technologists. And then it became very complicated, right? Between regulatory issues, practice standards, very hard to kind of get time off. Hospitals around the globe began to change and like, yeah, we're not really interested in that. We don't care. We just want to get the procedure done. We do want to get back to this point, and so what we decided to do is to start with a student exchange program. We just funded from the NMGI 3 universities to go abroad. We went to the UK for that to kind of start and get this initiative back off the ground. So now what we're doing is working with those universities to come over to the US, and we've started those conversations with Canada and Australia here as well, and see what we can kind of do with that. Because eventually, those students, right, are going to be our technologists and working side by side. And so if we have to start somewhere, and if that's just where we need to start, because that was the easier piece to do was university exchanges, then that's kind of where we're going to do. We also have sponsored sessions now together. So the Australia New Zealand Society of Nuclear Medicine have speakers and will present at our annual meetings. And really the goal of that is to begin to look at things. We're always slower to approve stuff in the US than it appears to be anywhere else in the world. So as we prepare to get FDA approvals for certain radiopharmaceuticals, we get to kind of hear already, how do you do this? When you have this approved and in your hospital, how do we do those procedures? What are you looking for? What's the benefit of this? And I will give huge kudos to Liz, who's done that for the last 2 years for us with the SNMMI. And it's been extremely beneficial because, yes, surprising or not, we just got lutetium approved literally 4 weeks ago in the US and dotatate about 3 months ago. So we are way behind kind of where everybody else is, but what was great is that we've been having sessions on how to do these procedures and we're not reinventing that wheel if you want to think about it. We also have a program working with the Australian group of where the award winner comes to the US and presents their research and their data on that as well, and looking at similar initiatives kind of elsewhere with other places. I've already talked a little bit about kind of what funding we're trying to do within the professional society to kind of help get this started, or kind of a start kick, and then we can kind of make that a little bit more sustainable as we move forward. And then really kind of creating these repositories of where this information lies, not only for ourselves, right, but also for our developing country colleagues as well. Because again, we want to elevate everyone. The quicker we elevate everyone, the better it is for all of us collectively in that together. When we talk about education specifically, we're doing quite a few global webinars now. And I think some of the challenges have been just how do we work within the different continuing education models or CPD models, and how can we overcome those barriers to make this a more easier transition for everyone is something that we can do. CT was probably our first real global barrier I think that many of us ran into was, how are we going to provide CT education? Some places everyone's a radiographer first and may not have had the same issue. In other places, this was a barrier. How do we get everybody up to speed with it? But if we look at the MR model, I think it's a model that we've all learned from and something that we can do. It was certainly the first organizational group that was an international society and not each country's own society for MR. There's an international MR society where everyone is doing the same thing. So it's a little easier to kind of create those standard practice or practice guidelines per se that you want to do, and we really need to work more with them. We have started working with them on how do we create that model for all of us as well. But as we move into more newer technologies, we're going to need this. It makes no sense for us to create something in the US, you guys to create something in Australia, Canada, or South Africa, or wherever we're at, is to really say, here's the resources, what is it that's the common good for all of us, and how can we leverage all of those together? Then how they're distributed, we'll leave that up to the political societies, right, to kind of figure out how to do that. But collectively, we're all imaging really the same way. Talking very briefly I've talked about the Mali supply. Again, I don't think that's as big of an issue, or at least from my understanding here in Australia, because you do have your own source. But for the rest of the world, this is a massive issue. And when we look at not having access to technetium, which is so critical to so many of our radiopharmaceuticals, what happens, right? You have referring physicians like, why can't I order that study? Oh, because we're not going to have tech tomorrow, or we can only do 1 or 2 studies tomorrow, so we're going to have, a 3 or 4 week kind of backlog on this. Then they turn to other modalities and find how they get those answers. They're not going to wait on us, right, because we think that we're great and that we're doing everything. They're just going to move on because they need to get those results. So we have to address that issue, and how are we, again, all going to be in the same boat together? Certainly with the newer technology, we want to continue to promote that, right, because we're allowed to lower those doses. So that's going to help all of us, ultimately, at the end of the day. And no matter where you live, right, we're constantly talking about the medical radiation exposure just continues to grow nationwide and is a public safety concern. So the better we are at that at the forefront, the easier it's going to be for us to address any criticism that comes back for that. And then the other really big opportunity that I've touched on is this being able to kind of share nationally what's going on, or more importantly, and Jeff talked a little bit about this, how do we grow research, right? If we can collectively come together and use those same standards and create the same research that everyone can be able to utilize, it allows for a faster development in these radiopharmaceuticals or these techniques, again, to kind of expand this field a tad bit faster. 2 quick things that you should know about is that the practice standards, which is what's kind of those minimum qualifications, or what is the minimum things that you can do, should be a global initiative that we're focused on, and we are going to be focused on that. Actually, the Australia-New Zealand group is going to kind of take the lead on this. We're not saying that you have to do this exactly the same worldwide, but what we do need is some minimum standards with this. Once we lose minimum standards, right, then we don't really have a profession as a whole. If someone in another country can come off the street and do our job, right, it's questioning kind of the value of where we need to get. So if we can kind of help these individuals as well, it helps us in the long run to continue to enhance that. Each organization has pretty much their own practice standards and how those operate, so what we want to do is to be able to look at what those similarities are and pull those out. The same for dose reduction. I told you that we've been working together on some dose reductions. There was some initial work done on pulling kind of what dose reduction means from each of the different countries that's been a part of this, and what resources they have into one. And so soon, I can't tell you when, but soon, this publication will be coming out. But it has all been reviewed, and it's went through each organization's kind of review process. So now we're just waiting for publication to get. That will be a great first step that we can really say, yeah, kind of worldwide, here's what we're doing about the problem with that. So while I think there's a huge opportunity for globalization among the societies, and it's something great for societies to talk about, I think the bigger piece for us as technologists is understanding that we do have an impact on these things. These are things that we do every day, and we leverage those every day. But we have to get much better at publicizing that, right? And Jeff mentioned a little bit about this. I always kind of laugh and make a little bit of a joke about this statement, but I think this statement is really true. If you pick up any nursing journal, I assure you there's not an article in those nursing journals that are not written by primary authors as nurse, right? This is true for pharmacy. You don't pick up a pharmacy journal and see everyone else writing their journals. Unfortunately, you pick up a lot of nuclear medicine journals where nuclear medicine technologists are not the first author, and in some cases, not the authors at all in it. They may have just been like, thanks to whoever. So these are the things that I think that we can do and really kind of continue to promote ourselves and be a part of that. Countries working together will speed development. The newer and more radiopharmaceuticals we have really increases our power as a whole and our sustainability. And we want, when we say nuclear medicine and molecular imaging worldwide, that everyone recognize what that is, right? Referring physicians know what that is and how that's done. And we all need to be able to speak the same language. It's difficult when we all kind of say something a little different. One of the comments that at least technologists back in my area, as I go out and visit the hospitals, they always say, oh, we got a lung scan that's ordered, but we told them to just do it in CT because we don't want to stay over and do the procedure. That's great. I understand that from a day-to-day perspective. However, if you keep pushing studies away, we have no jobs, right? And so we really need to kind of change that mindset and be like, you know what, no, we're much better at this, and here's why we should do this. And if you heard Liz's conversation, our talk on Friday, all these days run together now, about where we're moving to with SPECT VQ, these are the great opportunities that we can do to really show what we do. So kind of summarize all of this as an example is that we really are one, and we should not continue to try to operate the same beyond the fun and the social activities that we all have together and having colleagues worldwide, is that if we can speed up the research process and get nuclear medicine, molecular imaging being used more, that's going to help all of us. The more we can increase those studies, the bigger our departments can grow, the more staff that we can kind of have, and the bigger equipment operations that we can get. So I think there's global developments that's going to continue to happen between us. It is happening at a slower pace than I think any of us would like to see, but the more we all become more knowledgeable about what's happening, the better it is for it, and that I think staying involved in any professional organization is kind of one way to do that and to gain that, yes, I'm excited about my profession, and here's why I go to work every day for that, and we're all in the same boat with that, right? So with that, if you're ever in Boston, come and see me. It certainly did not look this way when I left. I should have put a picture of what it looked like trying to get to the airport. But we're entering summer, so we're about to enter that. But thank you.
Thanks, David. There's just one more talk to go with Jeff. It's very succinct. It's called partnering.
Yeah. So I guess that building on my first presentation and then David's, is that, you know, we can talk about internationalisation, we can talk about globalisation and strategies and all those things that we actually use, but in the end is that, you know, you've got to think about partnering, what partnering is. It's not more than just partnerships. So I'm going to talk about what partnering is, and just to reflect back on, you know, what it means for us to be global citizens versus some of the global initiatives. And there is a bit of a gap there, and so, you know, when you hear David or Liz or anyone else talking about some of those international initiatives, they're at a corporate level, okay? And so I guess what I'm trying to suggest to people is that let's get them beyond the corporate level, because you all know that the ANZ SNM has been working with the SNM for a long time at a corporate level. But how does that infiltrate down to us? Is it a benefit to the society, but how does that benefit trickle back to us? What's the kickback for us? And that's something that you have to ask when you think about who you're going to partner with. And it's not a criticism of it. I'm not swiping David. We've had this discussion earlier in the conference, is that, you know, next year the S&M conference is going to be in Anaheim, Disneyland, right? Well, beside Disneyland. And so when it's on the west coast of the US, is that we have over 100 nuclear medicine technologists from Australia go. So 10% of our workforce go to that conference. I mean, 100 doesn't sound like a lot, but that's 10% of our technologist workforce. Here we have the World Federation. And so, you know, we don't have a big representation of technologists from the SNM. We have a lot of physicians. We don't have a lot of representation of technologists. And so when you think about partnerships and whether you actually are genuinely having a good internationalisation strategy and whether it's partnered well, is you've got to think about who you're partnering with and making sure that there's actually an equitable relationship, that things go in both directions. And so I'm not suggesting that the SNM should fund more people to come, because the 100-odd technologists that will go to the US are going to be funded, by their employer, probably. There'll be a few that are funded by the ANZ SNM. But what it means is as professional body, the Australian nuclear medicine community is far more invested in the Society of Nuclear Medicine than the Society of Nuclear Medicine is invested in us. And that creates an inequitable partnership. And so what I'd like to see moving forward is to see the work that is done at the ANZS&M level, but also the work that's done at our level, actually starts to get a little bit of equilibrium in there, so we actually start to genuinely get those benefits. Because while it's actually an inequitable partnership, you do not actually get those benefits of globalisation and global citizenship. So I guess the rest of this is actually talking about who should you partner with, and how you decide to partner. And this could be at the corporate level, but it could be at our level. You know, when you're talking about in your clinical department, who you choose as a partner to have, as David said, you know, those international exchanges. Let's get staff over there and their staff over here, how you choose those partners. So I guess when you talk about partnering, this kind of partnering arrangement, which should be clearly delineated from partnerships I've already mentioned, allows collaboration between, you know, groups or entities with a shared common purpose, and that's really the crux of it. You've got to have a shared common purpose, and so many partnerships fall over, or collaborations fall over, because there's not actually a shared central vision. So success in partnering requires more than a vested interest from the partners. What's in it for them? So that's the question we ask, what's in it for us? And if one person's doing it because it's what's in it for them, and everyone else is doing it for altruistic reasons, well then it's not going to work. Some people are going to get something out of it short term, but long term it's not sustainable. And we've seen a lot of that in nuclear medicine over the last 20 or 30 years. So partnering success will depend on each partner being committed to and action through the 4 basic tenets of partnering, and that is direction, management, leadership and flexibility. Okay, and so you think about those, you know, people that you partner with, either at a small level, even if it's a commercial entity. You know, you go into a partnership with someone, with ANSTO who's supplying your generator, or GMS who's supplying your doses. You know, do you have direction, management, leadership and flexibility that's a shared purpose? And if it hasn't, well then that might explain some of the problems that you have and conflict. So apart from sharing a common purpose, partnering success is supported by all these things. It's got to have leadership, and it's not just a single leader. So it's all driven by one person. That one person is in one partnership corner. Okay, so you've got to have leadership in both camps, or sometimes it's more than 2 camps. So you might have partnership or a partnering arrangement between 3 or 4 entities. Very clear goals and objectives, flexible management of people, resources, time and relationships. Okay, you've all seen those movies where, you know, like, and you might have been in situations where people give you a very short period of time. You know, telemarketers do it. If you don't buy it now, the opportunity is not going to be there in 5 minutes' time. You've got to do it now. And people do this in partnerships and partnering. You know, sit there and say, look, I'm here now. If you don't sign up with me now, I'm going to go find someone else. And if that's the sales pitch, you should be going and looking for someone else. That's the wrong person to partner with. Okay, but we actually have those pressures that are put on those relationships. You need teamwork and cooperation, and most certainly you need trust. And I think that and communication. And I think that, you know, to be fair, is that you know, I'm part of a partnering arrangement that's been successful since 2007 with Pete and Matt Ayres when we formed RAINS, and the success of RAINS has really been driven by the fact that we have a partnering relationship that is built on all of these things, and it transcends the leadership group into all of the members and the people that we associate with. And so it just goes through the entire organisation and everything that's associated with it. But nothing's as easy as it looks, as we all know. You know, when something looks easy, you know that you're going to get a kick in the pants at some point. So how do you identify a partner? And without getting too personal, I've been single for 6 years. And I don't do online dating, but and I probably should, because, you know, the gene pool's pretty shallow in Wagga. And so I do have a couple of friends, and it's always the ladies that push you in that direction. So a couple of female friends have said, come on, Jeff, you've got to get on online dating. And I succumbed to their pressure, and we sat down and actually created an online account to one of these dating sites. And it's not one of the Tinder pickup sites. It's actually where you're supposed to find your life partner, you know, advertise on TV, all the success. And it took me 3 hours to put all my, had a big survey about who you are and all the rest of it. And it took me 3 hours to enter all this data and answer all their questions and all the rest of it. And then they put all your stuff into this big old search engine. It's just churning away. And it took 50 minutes to churn away. And the whole time it's got this little thing there saying, searching for your perfect matches, searching for your perfect matches. Hey, man, this is great. Look at all the names that are going to come up. It's searching for 50 minutes. Then after 50 minutes, it pops up and it says, here's a list of all your perfect matches. There was 3. There was 3.
And one of them was your ex-wife.
In all of Australia. And the nearest one was 450 kilometres away. So anyway, it's...
You obviously know him too well.
I do.
Yeah, that's right. But anyway, is that when we start to think about... identifying a partner, and we use this, in a previous presentation, David and I, is that it's actually the same. Okay, so we're going to go through a series of slides now, and every bit of advice on that actually comes from a dating website. Okay, so when you're actually identifying a partner, it's exactly the same principle in trying to identify a dating partner, I guess. So that's where we're going to go. Okay, and I've got the little link down the bottom there. You see, find the right partner or spouse. I'm sure Pete used that, didn't you?
My wife just made me muffins and knocked on the door, so I haven't. I'm sorry. But anyway,
but clearly Pete's wife wasn't using this advice either.
no.
But anyway, so identifying a partner. So adjust your mindset. So you need to love what you do. Okay, so you, as an institution or as a person or whatever it is that you're trying to partner, whether it's a corporation, is you got to love what it is that you do. If you're a business, you can't be sitting there going, okay, we're going to adjust what we do. If you love and invested in what you do and who you are as a person, an entity or whatever, well then that's what you take into the search for someone to partner with. And you need to be happy and independent. So if you don't get someone to partner with, then you don't force it. You just don't go searching. Otherwise, you're going to find the wrong partner. Okay, so you're going to end up with those partnering relationships that are not productive. Get some experience. I don't know really what that meant in terms of the dating thing, but it means that don't be bogged in. So it might mean that you actually have a short partnership. You end up in a partnering agreement that lasts for 12 months, and it's a trial thing. It has some sort of probationary period rather than being locked in for long term, just to dip your toe in the water and actually make sure you understand, especially if you're new to partnering or you've been out of the game for a long time, that you're not going to get burnt. And don't settle, so don't go into a partnering relationship that isn't quite the right thing just to be in that partnering relationship. And it comes back to the second point of being happy just to be that institution or that person or whatever it is that you are, without the partner. The partner, if it comes off, it comes off, but you can actually function alone. Know what you want. So you need to consider the qualities that you want in a partner. You need to be very, very clear when you go looking for that organisation or group to partner with, what it is that you're looking for. Okay? You don't just find someone because they're the big fish. Okay? They've got to have those things that tick the boxes of the things that you're looking for. Consider the qualities that you don't want. Okay, so what is it that you don't want in that institution that you want to partner with? And so if you're thinking about that clinical site, in the US, that you're actually thinking, well, we could exchange staff between them, between your site and theirs, or in the UK or whatever, is that these are the things that you need to be considering. Has their qualities in the way that they manage their practice or staff that we don't want to expose our staff to? Because you know what? They're going to come home after the exchange with those attributes and behaviours. So you need to be thinking about the things that you don't want as well as what you do. Get ready to compromise at some stage on many things, depending on where you sit in the power relationship. Obviously, there's more compromise if you're male. So, is that how your relationship works, Pete?
Sorry, mate, I zoned out.
Yeah, but it's got to go both ways. There has to be compromise. There's no perfect fit in a business relationship. There's got to be. And if you sit around a committee, whether it's a federal committee for ANZ S&M or S&M or the Canadian Association, there's going to be situations, and in fact we had that discussion last night, didn't we, Karen, about how you compromise when you're actually in a leadership position and to get the best outcomes versus when you no longer have to be part of that partnering relationship that you can say what you want. you don't have to compromise anymore. So picture the partnership in the future, okay? So, when you sit there and think, well, it's the right fit now, but you're going to grow and you're going to change, and your organisation may grow at a different rate and go in a different direction to the organisation you've partnered with. And so if you're not having that future vision in the same direction, well then while it might be a success today and tomorrow, then it's not going to be something that's sustainable. Look in all the right... Did I really say that? Look in all the right places. So ask colleagues that you trust. So sit there and go, okay, is it if I'm going to work with the Canadians, and I might talk to the US about what their experiences are. And we've certainly had that. In the past is that we actually had reciprocity with Canada, and Canada had reciprocity with the US. And, there's a little backdoor entry to get reciprocity with the US using the Canadians. And all those doors have closed now, but we used our experience with the Canadians to understand what the US was doing. And so that's what you need to be doing. You need to be looking in the right places, asking your colleagues, asking people that have the experience with those people before you jump into that partnership. Look for shared interests and, importantly, those underlying philosophies. Do you want to get the same thing as each other out of it? Go online. And so obviously that refers to dating, but it means the same thing for us, is that, you can get so much information about a company and their philosophy online. It's not really, everything is really public. So if you're interested in what the underlying philosophy of the Canadian Association is, then you can jump online and you can see not only what their public, presence is, but you can find all those other things behind the scenes, what people's opinions are about the Canadian Association, what their members think. Okay, so you use the online environment because information is everywhere, and it's just a matter of going, okay, well, is this a company that I can trust? Is this a company that has the same philosophy behind the front door pitch? Because we're all very good at, pitching, what people want to, you think people want to hear, but then, behind closed doors, you might be a different beast, and so you want to be able to see that. So, and be open, so people don't have to search for you. So if you or yourself be open and honest, then they know what they're actually entering into. And so there's no surprises for them either. And certainly if I'm trying to create a partnership in research or something, is that if the people that I'm trying to partner with are really upfront and honest, even if it's something I think, that's a bit rough, but that honesty is something that I know that I can then trust, rather than thinking that there's things that are hidden. Make sure it works. So make sure that partnership, the relationship that is built around whatever it is it's the most of mine around education and research and a bit of business, but make sure it's compatible and works. And you need to give it time and patience. Invest a little bit and make sure both parties invest in it as well. So it needs to be mutual. But make sure within that you need to have your own individual identities. And so, if you don't want to actually be part of this group, so if it's your department or your organisation or the ANZSNM, getting into a partnership with someone that's a bigger beast than you, like the S&M, if we lost our identity in that, well then it wouldn't be a very good fit. So we want to know that the S&M is going to actually appreciate and recognise our individual brand as well as the brand that we exist in the partnering arrangement. And of course it can't be short term. It's just a waste of time, too much energy, too much resources if it's not going to be a long-term thing. So of course every solution breeds new problems, and we know that too. Every time we solve a problem, there's about 10 more that pop up, and that keeps many people employed. So I guess that the issue is what are some of those solutions? And we live in a society today where we're driven towards immediate gratification. If we reflect on our parents, probably tell stories about, the first thing they did was buy a house when they got married, and then they worried about furniture afterwards. They had a milk crate to sit on, and they got a bed, and that's about it, and there was no TV. Whereas now is that we buy all the luxuries first. We want immediate gratification. That's what the credit card's about. We don't want to have to save money to buy something. We want to get it now, and then we'll pay for it later. And that translates to research. The reason we actually get people that move away from research is simply because, well, not the only reason, but because you don't get immediate gratification. It's a lot of bloody hard work for a lot of time before you actually get that publication that pops up into the journal. That could be 3 or 4 years down the track. And people just don't have the patience for that. They want that immediate gratitude, immediate recognition that they've done something good. And so in partnering, it's the same, is that you don't get immediate gratification. Okay, it takes a lot of hard work, and it could be years down the track before you actually really genuinely reap the rewards. And when you hear Liz talk about the partnering arrangements that ANZS has with the S&M and David and others, these are things that they've actually planted seeds, and it's taking a long time for them to germinate and then to grow. And I guess that's why I've got a little bit of horticulture on the screen, is that I often talk about students in terms of horticulture, is that when you actually want to skinny dip in your pool at home and you want to actually have a privacy screen, so you actually get a hedge that grows really fast so the neighbours can't see you skinny dipping, is that those hedges die really fast as well. Okay, so when you've got a tree that grows fast, it also has a very short life. And so what we need to do with partnering is think about horticulture and have the patience to actually plant a seed that takes a long time and the right conditions to germinate. And it grows slow, because then that's going to be that stable tree that's going to be there for 300 or 400 years. And so we don't want any weeds. Okay, so we want to get rid of the weeds and of course the things that are just there for a bit of fun as well. And so the last one there, does anyone know what that is?
Where?
I'll put it on. Oops. The one on the far right. Does anyone know what that is? It's a tree. Does anyone know where that tree is? It even tells you what it is. It's a ginkgo tree. So we need to be looking at ginkgo. We want partnerships that are ginkgo. That is actually a tree that survived the Hiroshima bombings. Okay, ginkgo is actually relatively robust to many things. And so there's a whole bunch of these ginkgo trees around Japan that survived either in Nagasaki or Hiroshima. And so they're the same trees, that they just lost their leaves and then came back. And that's the kind of thing that we really need to be thinking about for partnering, is that you want things that are going to survive the Holocaust, and they're going to survive a nuclear bomb, because you're going to have times in a partnering relationship that are really tough, that things don't go the right way. There's going to be financial constraints, political constraints, and when you get to the other side, you will still want to have a few green leaves to be able to reflect on. And so I guess that it's a little bit like Tetris, and I don't play Tetris myself, but I've seen a lot of people that sit there spending a lot of time, and when you look at the solutions, is that if you've got something like this where everything just seems all random, but you can see everything's going to line up and fall into place. And so good planning and a lot of patience not only reaps rewards, but it also lays a really solid foundation for everything that you're going to do moving forward. But sometimes we sort of blink and realise that, despite all this great planning, is that you blink and you've got something that messes things up for you, and you've got to change your plan. And of course, sometimes people don't plan at all. And if you have no planning, you have no sustainability. And so I guess that the end message is that, like Tetris, that in partnering, your failures tend to accumulate. And when you have a success, they tend to just vanish and become something that you've built on. And you've got to be accepting of that without actually expecting to get that constant gratitude. So in the end, brick walls are not there to keep us out. This is very similar to the quote that we heard from Karen earlier. The brick walls are there to give us a chance to show how badly we want something. And so I just think we need to break down the walls, and we're in that position now. Break down the walls and make sure we actually develop those partnering relationships with the right recipe for success. And I think that's all I had.
We've got a bit of time for discussion, so can I ask David and Jeff to come up? No one's breaking down the doors to get in here, I think, so we've got afternoon tea, so very good. I might use the chair's advantage and start off with a comment and then a question, if that's okay. I was just going to, guys, just wind back to just the globalisation and the impact it has on nuclear medicine, just as a comment. When we talk about globalisation, I think the big elephant in the room is always China. And I know that in Western Australia, the advent of 2 new radiotherapy machines, and there's a third one going in, and some PET-CT scanners is effectively a courtesy of debt finance running out of China. So the two big behemoths in the corporate sector are owned ultimately by Chinese companies. And I think that's a positive thing, I guess, in the sense that that's going to improve the access for a lot of people in Western Australia to radiotherapy machines. And China's doing magnificent things that we read in terms of lifting people out of poverty, so that should be applauded. But on the same token, we need to be concerned about the fact that a country which has issues with human rights and what have you has ownership of very important infrastructure for Australian cancer treatment. So that's just something, I don't know what the right answer to that is, but in terms of maintaining autonomy, because it does, another negative it erodes the public health service, because some of the people that work in the public health service gravitate to want to work with the best machines, and that can create an imbalance. So that's just something to think about in terms of globalisation and the impact on China. In terms of what David was talking about with exchange programs, I always remember working when I was in the public sector that there was a wonderful relationship between the Australian physicians and the American physicians, and Ann Arbor used to always come up in Michigan. So it was almost like a rite of passage for many physicians to head over there. I'm not sure if that's still in place, but there never was anything similar in my recollection. Maybe Liz could say for technologists, and I'm just wondering whether with the NMGI, whether that's a topic that's discussed, whether we can re-establish or create new pathways for technologists to spend times doing 6 or 12 month sabbaticals, which could be supported by, sponsorship maybe from the private sector or through the associations, because fostering those sort of relations, they last a lifetime. And that's what also attracts, I think it helps with future conferences. Having those sort of, really ingrained relationships is excellent. So just curious to know.
Yes, I'll give you my opinion. It's not an official thing. I think the new challenge is regulations that exist, right? And it's very difficult to get anyone coming from somewhere outside the U.S. to be able to practice in the States without the certification. And certainly that's the same here now as well, of having those. That's where I think maybe the better approach, or an easier approach to get into this, as we figure out all these things, right, and plant the seeds that Jeff talked about, that's going to take a while to do, is to do it from a student perspective. That is a much easier pathway because universities for millions of years, right, have had abroad programs. And so being able to create that and sustain that at that point and allow them to move into their profession, hopefully will continue to generate that and be like, oh yes, I remember when I was in Australia for 6 months, or whatever the case may be, is one approach for that. So we certainly have looked at it a lot. I'll speak just from the SNMMI's perspective. For a technologist, the challenge always comes down to, but can they practice here? And what type of visas need to occur with that, and so forth. Whereas that medical education is just different with physicians and those crossing the borders,
Yes.
As opposed to what we have.
It's sometimes, the regulation of our profession, there's much to be I'm excited about there in some respects. That's not the right bloody word, I suppose, but to admire with the regulation. But have we gone too far in the sense that we've blocked opportunities in international cooperation? Because it was there really to protect the public, to make sure that we had professional operators out there, and I think that's a magnificent thing, an important thing. But if it's precluding us from fostering new relationships internationally, I had some colleagues that work for a private radiology practice recently owned by a Chinese company, and they went over to China to look at the second-tier hospitals with 2,000 bed second-tier hospitals. And they could see that there was differences in the way the protocols were, and in terms of the way the doctors interpreted the images was very, very surprising and eyebrow raising to them. And they saw opportunities where our knowledge base could be swapped over and bring them over here, but because of these regulatory hurdles, it's not a good thing. I don't think so.
I think there's two parts of it though. Is that there is a good thing about it, and I think in some cases is that it hasn't precluded anyone from coming. It's just made it more, probably add a little bit of time to it. So there is no reason why someone from an international community can't apply for registration in Australia.
Yeah.
There's a process for them to do it.
Yes.
And the difficulty is it's going to take time. And if you're from the US and you've done a 4-year degree, and that they're going to see the similarities with our training programs, and you're probably going to get approved. Then you can worry about your visa and all the rest of it and getting a job. If you're coming from a country that does not have the same standard of technologist education, well then you're not going to get approved. And that protects the Australian public, and I think that it needs to do that. While it might look like it's not necessarily working in two directions, is that you've got legal obligations to protect our profession and our patients. There's no reason why they can't come over as students or visitors.
No, I can see students.
But it's actually important that you actually protect it. But those things exist. Some of the things have closed. We used to just walk in and out of Canada, or they used to come here. And at St Vincent's Hospital and Royal Prince Alfred Hospital, where I worked years ago, we used to have
Canadians.
You always had Canadians and Americans working there and have different exchanges. And
They were the only ones that really worked.
And
actually.
Boston still has some of our techs over there. So and Ann Arbor still has Andrew Whedon, because some of them go and they find the love of their life and don't come back. So so it's always been there. And so the ARPA registration, I think, is really important, because it provides a layer of protection. But we just need to learn how to navigate that a little bit quicker than what we currently.
I guess I'm sort of looking at the angle if you could give them a year sabbatical where they could say sort of supervised arrangements so they could pay their way, but they're not there. They're only just here for a year, and then you head back. And we could send one over there, and they could send one back. I'm not sure whether those structures.
We kind of most probably need to start thinking a bit laterally about this stuff, because the physicists and the radiopharmaceutical scientists do this all the time.
Yeah.
But they do it under these things called preceptorships or observerships. So in fact, they're coming out, they're having the experience for 8 weeks, 12 weeks, whatever it may be. They're coming out to do a project.
Yes.
They have a supervisor on site.
Yeah.
And they're able to get the global experience of being in a different country and seeing all the great things that we're doing.
And are they funded?
Back to their workforce.
Yeah.
And it doesn't really impact on registration. You're not saying, well, I'm going to move to Australia to work here and live forever, because I think that's a whole separate issue. But to actually exchange ideas and get experience in another country, I think there are options to do it for technologists.
Especially since they're probably going to get paid at home, not here.
Correct.
So
kind of that's what it is. It's especially if they could be doing postgraduate studies at the university. They may get a scholarship to come over here, and they work, say, so they'll come work at North Shore for 12 weeks because they want to. Their department wants to introduce lutetium therapy. So they'll come to North Shore, and they're observerships, and they're observing the treatments. They're learning new things. We give them a task. Go ahead and observe these patients and look at their outcomes and present a white paper to the department, and we'll help you publish something. So I think there's ways to do it. I think we've just got to think laterally about how it's achievable. And it doesn't necessarily need registration or regulatory issues. Obviously there are hurdles to jump over, but there are ways to achieve
I think it would be an extraordinary initiative. I mean, I know the number of technologists that have maybe been 2 or 3 year postgraduate that have put their hand up for 3 months or 6 months to share their knowledge in a small province in China, and virtually Chinese organisations that want to learn lutetium therapy. I mean, there's no better place to learn that in some of it. We are leading institutions here.
I think the difficulty is if it's a technologist and they're coming here. So our students still have to be registered with ARPA.
Right.
So students have to be registered with ARPA. So
it depends on whether they're planning to have any interactions with patients.
Yeah, so if they're not interacting with patients, they're genuinely just observing, then you wouldn't need to do it. But if they are coming at that level where they're actually going to help with doing any scanning or doing any hands-on, then you'll have to work out some arrangement with ARPA that they actually have student or preceptor supervised registration.
I think it'd be worth the effort.
I don't think it would be that hard.
No, I don't think so either. I think all of that stuff is achievable.
Yeah.
But if you're going to get the guys that come from the US or from Canada, you're going to want them as part of your workforce. And so that's when they're actually going to need registration.
Yeah.
So one of the comments I'd like to make is that the focus so far that I've been listening to is training and globalization and partnering with the US, the Canadian communities, maybe in the Western sphere. But we are sitting in Asia Pacific, and much of what we have been discussing is actually very difficult to apply within regional developing nations, where the technologies, the education is not comparable. It is very difficult for people from even Singapore, which is one of the most advanced countries within this region. But then it's worse for countries like Burma or Thailand.
Yes.
And one of my views has been we have a responsibility, we being who we are in Australia, in this Australasian Asia-Pacific region, we actually have an opportunity to lead and provide guidance and education to people who probably do need it.
Yes.
But we have significant challenges because our education standards are different, registration requirements are different, and language is a huge barrier. So I think within this discussion, this also has a place.
Yeah, totally agree.
And
Well,
how we can then...
Do you think that there's actually an avenue, because I'm just thinking that we actually have our students registered with APRA, but, you know, is there a role for the new Asian Oceania School of Nuclear Medicine?
Definitely.
That we could actually have, you know, ignoring, you know, the developed countries, but out of the Asian countries, that a technologist
A technologist working group.
technically
Yep.
would be a student within that school, and so then we're actually applying for national registration as a student to come to Australia. And I think that would be except that the APRA do have a requirement that as a student you have a minimum English language proficiency of 6. So. So you would need that as evidence, but is it? I don't think that. I think that would be a way to engage with our region.
I think that's certainly a
Good
way.
mechanism.
I'm just putting it out there that we have to be thinking of different ways to engage with different nations.
Yeah, the developing world, absolutely. Yeah.
I think the biggest hurdle in Asia is financial.
The financial.
You know, the Western developed countries have more access and ability to get some type of scholarship and funding to go to various parts of the world to do some training in Asia Pacific.
It's difficult,
It-
but
it's financially
it is challenging. But the IAEA
It
is
doesn't
offering
really
some
can't
support.
happen, but yeah, I think that's one of the biggest hurdles, especially at the technologist level. There's certainly more funding to get physicians and scientists here than there are technologists.
You want a question?
My name is Maria, please.
Hello?
Actually, I want to little bit share about my experience with Royal National Hospital.
Yeah.
In 2013, I was introduced to Prof. Berry from Eden. I know her from Ensto, and I don't know. I just tried to contact whichever Australian hospital because in Indonesia we don't have anyone, any researcher who really consistent doing like the dosimetry research.
Yeah.
Then 2013, I know Prof. Berry. Once he comes to Indonesia, also we invite in the annual meeting of Nuclear Medicine Society.
Yeah.
Then it's growing up in 2015. I got like a project from ministry. I invite Prof. Berry, also another researcher from Peter MacCallum Hospital. At the moment, because I'm like a new one in Nuclear Medicine Society, so when I talk about nuclear medicine dosimetry, like every clinician said, "Oh, we don't need that because it's not important," something like that. Then, sorry, I'm a little bit nervous.
Yeah.
Because it will be different if someone who really expert and really
Yes.
well acknowledged, because Prof. Berry is also like he.
Oh, yeah.
I think, he authoring a nuclear medicine handbook for resident and student.
Yes.
And once he talked about that nuclear medicine dosimetry is must for radiotherapy. Then everyone start to understand, start to accept, and it's still growing now. In 2017, Indonesia has got a research contract from IE. It's a contracted program
Yep.
called like dosimetry for nuclear medicine therapy. So that's why I'm interested in this talk, because Royal National Hospital is the I think the center of where we can learn anything from them, because at the moment, I don't have any contact with patient, but I just like following a step. by, you know, what do you call it, like, observation and
Yeah,
and,
you know, there's got to be mechanism to support, you know, your motivation to learn, and I mean, there are probably mechanisms within APRA that we can to explore to foster that cooperation, particularly Indonesia, Thailand, and the whole Pacific Rim. I think would be a wonderful initiative to get involved with. And with Trump taking better action in the Asia region.
I live in the
sure.
part of the country that's not.
Yeah.
Anyway.
One good point is now everyone in the parliament has said that, okay, accepting internal symmetry, like we start from, even we still start in the beginning, but not everyone is already accepting this.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
Thank you
for
so
that.
much.
So just to add that, so thank you, and I think what you said was really important and a great summary as we end this section, right? And this was kind of what hopefully we were trying to get at, right, in the session as a whole. If we're not saying the same things and speaking the same language, it is difficult to grow this profession as a whole. And I think having, whether we start at the top level organizations and work our way all the way down, we've got to create some of these kind of common goals and common tools to use so that it is beneficial to everyone and not just for us on things. So
Yes, yeah.
that was great. Congrats. Welcome.
All right. Morning, afternoon tea
See you.
beckons, I think. Yeah. So look, I'll just close the session. Thank you all for attending. It was wonderful.